the grand sweep of history, few events have reshaped the world as profoundly as the American Revolution. Yet, movies and quiet museum galleries, it's easy to forget just how improbable it all once seemed. To imagine the world before the first shock, a reality where Britain stood as the unmatched global superpower of its age, where monarchies dominated political life, and where the idea of an ordinary citizen challenging a king was unthinkable, if not laughable. And still, across the Atlantic Ocean, in 13 scattered colonies built along the rugged edges of a vast continent, a different experiment was quietly taking shape. It was fragile, it was imperfect, but it carried within it the spark of something revolutionary, literally and figuratively. This is where our story begins. The year is the mid-1700s. The colonies are places of stark contrasts. Bustling port cities like Boston and Philadelphia, frontier towns carved out of deep forests, and sprawling farms that stretch over rolling countryside. Life is harsh at times, promising at others, but always defined by a sense of distance, from London, from the crown, and from the rigid hierarchies that shaped European life. The colonists are technically British subjects, but many feel as though they are building something new, something that neither Parliament nor King George III fully understands. Yet despite that distance, the ties to Britain remain strong. English customs influence daily life. British goods fill colonial markets. And for many years, the colonies enjoy a comfortable degree of autonomy, free enough to govern their own affairs yet protected by the powerful British Navy. Life is not without its tensions, but few imagine rebellion. Fewer still imagine independence. That idea lies dormant, not yet fully realized, waiting for the world to change. And the world does change, suddenly and dramatically. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, ignites a chain reaction that transforms colonial life forever. Britain emerges victorious, but victory comes at a staggering cost. The empire's finances are drained. Parliament looks across the ocean and decides the colonies, prosperous and expanding, should help shoulder the burden of this expensive triumph. What seems logical in London feels oppressive in the colonies. Suddenly, taxes appear. Acts are passed. Regulations tighten. A distant government begins reaching into the wallets, the presses, and the private homes of Americans who have grown accustomed to self-rule. At first, the grumblings are mild, complaints over dinner tables, whispers in crowded taverns. But day by day, protest grows from an ember into an open flame. What happens next is not the work of a single moment or a single man. It is the rise of a movement. A slow building of frustration that becomes resistance, and resistance that becomes action. From Boston's narrow streets to Virginia's wide plantations, colonists begin asking questions. Who truly has the right to rule them? What does fair representation mean? Can a people be loyal subjects while demanding autonomy? And what happens when a government refuses to listen? These questions ignite the minds of intellectuals and farmers alike. Men like Samuel Adams shape the message of resistance. Women take up roles as organizers, boycotters, and political actors in ways they had not before. Printers, artists, sailors, and laborers begin to define their identity not just as colonists, but as something new. The concept of American, once a mere geographical descriptor, starts to carry emotional weight. By the time British soldiers march onto Boston's streets, muskets gleaming beneath the heavy New England sky, the relationship between colony and crown has already begun to fracture. Tensions build. Tempers rise. And though many hope for reconciliation, the gap between what the colonists demand and what the empire is willing to give widens day by day. The decade that follows is one of remarkable transformation, political, cultural, and ultimately military. It is a decade where ordinary people rise into extraordinary roles. Where farmers become soldiers, philosophers become revolutionaries, and statesmen become architects of independence. It is a decade marked by bloodshed and sacrifice, wisdom and contradiction, victories and devastating losses. And it is in this decade that the American identity is forged, not through myth or romanticism, but through the trial by fire that is revolution. To tell this story in just 15 minutes is no small challenge, yet it holds an advantage. It forces us to focus not on every detail, but on every turning point. To understand not simply what happened, but why it mattered. The revolution is more than a list of battles. It is a struggle of ideas, ideas about power, freedom, legitimacy, and human rights. It is one of the first times in modern history that a population stood up and declared the right to govern themselves, not because a ruler permitted it, but because they believed it was their natural inheritance. But the revolution is also a story of contradiction. A story where many fought for liberty while denying it to others. Where promises of equality coexisted with systems of slavery, patriarchal law, and restricted citizenship. These contradictions do not weaken the revolution, they humanize it. They remind us that revolutions are not moments of perfection, but beginnings. Imperfect beginnings that plant seeds for future generations to cultivate, challenge, and expand. And so the stage is set. A vast empire strained by war. A rising people questioning old authority. A world on the brink of transformation. And from the tension of these opposites emerges a conflict that will define a nation and set the course for centuries to come. This is not just the story of muskets fired and declarations written. It is the story of people, of courage, resilience, ambition, and belief. It is the story of how a scattered group of colonies united to challenge the most powerful empire on earth. It is the story of the American Revolution, reimagined and condensed, a sweeping narrative distilled into 15 minutes, without sacrificing its depth, its humanity, or its enduring impact. Welcome to the Revolutionary War in 15 minutes. The fight for independence starts now. The movement toward revolution did not erupt overnight, it simmered, quietly at first, beneath the rhythms of everyday colonial life. To understand the path to revolt, we must return to the moment Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War. Though celebrated in London as a triumph of imperial dominance, the war left Britain with staggering debts. The empire stretched wider than ever before, but its coffers were dangerously thin. And as Parliament surveyed its growing territories, it turned its gaze toward the 13 American colonies, believing they should pay a share of the war's cost, especially since so much of it had been fought on North American soil. But what seemed self-evident in Britain landed poorly in America. The colonies had grown used to governing themselves with minimal British interference. For decades, distance had created a kind of unofficial independence. Colonists elected their own assemblies, oversaw their internal affairs, and lived with a sense of autonomy uncommon in most European territories. Now, with Parliament imposing new taxes, regulations, and soldiers on the ground, that autonomy felt threatened. The first major shock came with the Sugar Act of 1764, tightening duties on imported molasses. Though economically impactful, it was the next act, the Stamp Act of 1765, that ignited outrage. For the first time, Parliament levied a direct tax on the colonies, requiring stamps on newspapers, legal documents, cards, licenses, almost everything involving printed paper. The symbolism struck a nerve. Colonists argued that only their own elected assemblies had the authority to tax them. Parliament countered with the idea of virtual representation, the notion that all British subjects were represented in Parliament whether they voted or not. But to colonists an ocean away, virtual sounded suspiciously like none at all. And so the protests began, slowly at first. Merchants complained of declining profits. Lawyers grumbled about fees. Printers published fiery essays condemning the act. One of the first organized groups to appear was the Sons of Liberty, born in Boston's taverns and meeting halls under the leadership of Samuel Adams and a circle of passionate patriots. Their demonstrations grew from symbolic acts to bold public displays, hanging effigies of tax officials and organizing boycotts. Their message was spreading, and with it, a new awareness: the colonies could resist British authority. The backlash forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, but victory was short-lived. Britain, unwilling to relinquish control, passed the Declaratory Act, asserting full authority to govern the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a quiet threat, one that foreshadowed the escalating conflict ahead. The next wave came with the Townshend Acts, imposing new taxes on glass, paint, lead, paper, and most famously, tea. To enforce compliance, Britain increased its military presence, particularly in Boston, where resentment already simmered. British redcoats patrolled the streets, their bright uniforms a constant reminder of imperial power. Friction between soldiers and citizens intensified, fueled by competition for work, cultural clashes, and a growing sense of occupation. This tension burst violently on March 5, 1770. A crowd gathered outside the Customs House, jeering and throwing snowballs packed with debris. The soldiers, surrounded and frightened, fired into the crowd. 5 colonists died that night in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Though the event itself was chaotic and brief, its impact was enormous. Patriot leaders like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams seized the moment to portray it as a deliberate slaughter, fueling public anger and unifying colonial sentiment against Britain. The massacre became a rallying cry, a symbol of what unchecked imperial authority could lead to. In the years that followed, Britain withdrew some taxes but kept the tax on tea, not for revenue, but to assert principle. This decision planted the seed for one of the Revolution's most iconic acts of defiance, the Boston Tea Party. On a cold night in December 1773, dozens of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships anchored in Boston Harbor. With swift efficiency, they split open hundreds of crates and dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the water, sending a message as clear as the ripples in the harbor: the colonies would not submit quietly. Britain's response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, targeted Massachusetts with punishing restrictions. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was repaid. The colonial charter was rewritten to strip away self-governance, and British troops were granted expanded authority, including the right to be quartered in private homes. The goal was to isolate Boston and make it an example, but the effect was the opposite. Sympathy for Massachusetts swept through the colonies. What had begun as regional frustration was evolving into a shared colonial cause. For the first time, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. What happened inside those candlelit chambers would change history. For weeks, delegates debated rights, governance, and the nature of British authority. They were not yet ready to declare independence, but they were ready to stand united. Together they agreed to organize boycotts, prepare militias, and issue a declaration of colonial rights. As the Congress dispersed, a sense of collective identity took root. The colonies were no longer isolated communities, they were a movement. But Britain did not back down. In early 1775, intelligence reached British commanders that colonial militias were stockpiling weapons in the countryside. Determined to suppress rebellion before it ignited, British General Thomas Gage ordered troops to march on Lexington and Concord. What the British expected to be a swift mission would instead mark the explosive beginning of open war. Before dawn on April 19, 1775, British soldiers approached Lexington Green. Waiting for them were dozens of colonial militiamen, farmers, tradesmen, young men with old muskets, many having never faced battle before. The two sides stood in tense silence under the pale morning sky. Then, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. But that single bullet, the shot heard round the world, turned years of tension into full-fledged conflict. Skirmishes erupted. At Concord's North Bridge, colonists pushed the British back. As redcoats retreated toward Boston, militias from miles around poured in, firing from behind stone walls and trees. By nightfall, nearly 300 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The rebellion could no longer be dismissed. Ordinary colonists had taken up arms against the greatest empire on earth. A movement had transformed into a revolution. From taxes to tea, from peaceful petitions to armed resistance, the beginning of the movement was shaped by a simple truth: the colonists believed their rights were being threatened, and they refused to surrender them quietly. What started as scattered protests across small towns and city streets had grown into something larger, something unstoppable. The colonies were ready to fight, not just for relief from taxes or fair representation, but for something they had not yet spoken aloud: independence. The world was about to change forever. The movement that began as scattered resistance quickly evolved into a full-scale revolution. But revolutions are never won by ideas alone. They rely on people, individuals who rise to the moment, often unexpectedly, driven by conviction, circumstance, or a sense of destiny. The American Revolution was no different. Its survival in the early years depended not just on collective will, but on the leadership, sacrifice, and resilience of men and women who stepped into roles they never imagined they would hold. At the center of this emerging struggle stood a figure who would come to embody the American cause: George Washington. When the Second Continental Congress convened in 1775, delegates from all 13 colonies arrived unsure of how to manage a war most of them had hoped to avoid. They needed a commander, someone who could unite militias from different colonies, maintain discipline in an army still more volunteer than professional, and confront the formidable British military. Washington, a tall and dignified Virginian with a reputation for courage and integrity, seemed the natural choice. He accepted the role with a solemn sense of responsibility, aware that he was stepping into a conflict with little precedent and even less certainty. Washington's early challenges were immense. His army, newly named the Continental Army, was undertrained, unevenly equipped, and lacking in unity. Soldiers brought their own weapons, their own clothes, and often their own understanding of what it meant to fight. Some enlisted for weeks, others for months, few committed to long service. Washington faced shortages of powder, food, tents, blankets, shoes, and even basic tools. Disease spread through camps. Morale fluctuated wildly. But despite the chaos, he remained steady, becoming a symbol of perseverance for troops who desperately needed one. Surrounding Washington was a cast of remarkable leaders, each contributing to the revolution in their own way. John Adams, fiery and relentless, pushed tirelessly for independence within Congress. His brilliant legal mind and uncompromising dedication made him one of the revolution's intellectual architects. Thomas Jefferson, shy but eloquent, crafted the poetic and philosophical core of the movement through the Declaration of Independence, words that would echo through centuries, far beyond the war itself. And Benjamin Franklin, a statesman of wit, charm, and genius, became the revolution's most influential diplomat. His work in France would later secure alliances that changed the course of the war. But the revolutionary cause was never the work of well-known names alone. Its early years were shaped by thousands of ordinary people who faced the harsh realities of war with limited resources and uncertain futures. Many soldiers came from farms and workshops, leaving behind families, crops, and small businesses. Their sacrifice was not merely military, it was personal and immediate. Every enlistment meant risking hunger, debt, and death. And yet men continued to step forward, inspired by the belief that they were defending their homes, their rights, and their future. Women, too, played indispensable roles. With husbands and sons away, they maintained households and worked farms. Many became messengers, fundraisers, and organizers. Some, like Abigail Adams, influenced political thought, others disguised themselves as men to fight on the battlefield. Women ran the economy while the men carried muskets. They formed the silent backbone of the revolution, a role long overlooked but essential to its success. The early battles tested this developing network of soldiers and civilians. After Lexington and Concord, the British found themselves trapped in Boston by an expanding American siege. In July 1775, Washington assumed command of the Continental Army there. His first major test came in early 1776, when he learned of the British plan to reinforce their troops. Washington needed a victory, not just for strategy, but for morale. With help from Henry Knox, a bookseller turned artillery officer, Washington accomplished a feat many thought impossible, hauling massive cannons over frozen rivers and snowy mountains from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. These cannons were placed on Dorchester Heights, threatening the British fleet and forcing the enemy to evacuate the city in March 1776. It was a symbolic triumph, one that boosted American spirits and showcased Washington's resourcefulness. But victory in Boston was followed by disaster in New York. The British returned with overwhelming force, tens of thousands of troops supported by the world's most powerful navy. Washington's outnumbered army suffered defeat after defeat, retreating from Long Island, Manhattan, and eventually across New Jersey. For many, the revolution seemed doomed. British officers believed the rebellion was collapsing. Members of Congress worried they had pushed the colonies too far into conflict. Soldiers deserted. Supplies dwindled. Winter approached, cold and unforgiving. Yet in the darkest moments, leadership reveals itself most clearly. Washington refused to surrender. Instead, he watched, waited, and planned a bold counterattack. On Christmas night, 1776, as icy winds whipped across the Delaware River, he led his exhausted army across the freezing waters. The crossing was treacherous, men slipped on icy decks, boats filled with frigid water, and horses fought against the current. But by dawn, Washington's troops reached the New Jersey shore and marched toward Trenton, surprising a Hessian garrison. The victory was swift and decisive. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. These two small battles did not defeat the British, but they revived the revolution. They restored confidence in Washington. They reminded the colonies that the dream of independence was still alive. Still, hardship persisted. The early years were filled with logistical failures. Congress struggled to supply the army. Inflation soared. Uniforms were scarce. Shoes were rarer still. Soldiers marched across frozen ground, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Disease killed more men than bullets. Many questioned whether the colonies were fighting a hopeless war, led by an inexperienced army against a global superpower. And yet, the revolution endured, not because victory seemed likely, but because defeat was unthinkable. Colonists believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves. The early years shaped the spirit that would carry the revolution through its darkest moments. As Washington held the army together on the battlefield, political leaders fought their own battles in Congress. Debates raged over independence, alliances, financing, and the future structure of government. These debates were intense, often divisive, but they forced the colonies to confront a crucial truth: if they were going to win the war, they had to imagine, and commit to, what came after it. By 1777, the revolution had evolved from spontaneous resistance into an organized struggle for nationhood. It was no longer a question of taxes or representation. It was a question of identity, of destiny, of who the American people were and who they would become. The early struggles had revealed the revolution's vulnerabilities. But they had also revealed its strengths, its leaders, its resilience, and its capacity for unity during crisis. And soon, a turning point would arrive that would change the course of the war forever. By 1777, the American Revolution had settled into a grueling stalemate. The British expected the rebellion to collapse under the weight of defeats, shortages, and internal discord. Many in Parliament believed the colonists lacked the unity, discipline, and resources needed to sustain a long war. In truth, they weren't entirely wrong. America was hanging on by threads of courage and determination. But history has turning points, moments when the improbable becomes the inevitable. For the Revolution, that moment arrived with a single campaign in upstate New York, Saratoga. The British strategy seemed simple: isolate New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne proposed marching a large army south from Canada, along the Hudson River Valley. Meanwhile, British forces in New York City would move north to meet him. Once the two armies joined, the colonies would be split in half. New England would be cut off, and the rebellion, so the British believed, would wither and die. But British plans often underestimated one thing: the sheer unpredictability of war on American soil. Dense forests, rugged terrain, long supply lines, and a determined local population turned Burgoyne's ambitious march into a slow, exhausting journey. American militiamen cut down trees to block roads, destroyed bridges, and harassed British supply lines. Every mile gained was a battle. Every river crossing felt like a siege. As Burgoyne's army pushed south, American forces gathered under the command of General Horatio Gates. But within these ranks, perhaps the most dynamic and controversial figure was Benedict Arnold, a man whose name today is synonymous with betrayal, but who at Saratoga fought with unmatched courage and intensity. Arnold clashed repeatedly with Gates, whose leadership style was cautious and political. Arnold, by contrast, was bold and relentless. These differences sparked internal conflict within the American command, yet on the battlefield Arnold's aggressive tactics proved crucial. He inspired soldiers, rallied faltering lines, and refused to give ground even when outnumbered. Two key battles defined the campaign. The first, at Freeman's Farm, inflicted heavy losses on the British and slowed their advance. The second, the Battle of Bemis Heights, broke their momentum entirely. Arnold, defying Gates's orders, charged into the fray, leading from the front with fearless determination. His actions helped shatter a major British assault and forced Burgoyne into retreat. Within weeks, encircled and running out of supplies, Burgoyne had no choice. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered more than 5,000 troops to the American army. It was one of the most significant victories of the war, stunning Britain and electrifying the colonies. Saratoga was more than a military triumph, it was proof. Proof that the Americans could stand against the British Empire. Proof that the Revolution was not a lost cause. and proof that the colonies might just be worth supporting. Across the Atlantic, France watched closely. Ever since their defeat in the 7 Years' War, the French sought opportunities to weaken Britain. But they hesitated to join the American cause without evidence that the rebellion had a fighting chance. After Saratoga, that evidence was undeniable. Benjamin Franklin, already in Paris as an American diplomat, seized the moment. With his charm, intelligence, and political finesse, he convinced French leadership that an alliance was not just feasible but advantageous. In February 1778, France formally recognized American independence and agreed to military support. This alliance changed everything. For the first time, the Americans had a powerful navy to counter Britain's dominance at sea. French soldiers, commanders, weapons, and money began flowing into the war effort. And perhaps most importantly, Britain now faced a global conflict. They had to defend interests not just in America, but in Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia. The British war machine, once focused and overwhelming, was suddenly stretched thin. But the turning point did not mean immediate victory. The winter following Saratoga would test the Continental Army like never before. At Valley Forge, Washington's troops endured brutal cold, starvation, disease, and despair. More than 2,500 soldiers died. Thousands lacked shoes, leaving their bloody footprints in frozen snow. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate, and shelters barely suitable for survival. Yet Valley Forge was not merely a chapter of suffering, it was a crucible of transformation. Enter Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer whose presence would reshape the American army. Despite exaggerated claims of his credentials, von Steuben possessed a deep understanding of military organization and discipline. He brought structure where chaos reigned. Through drills, demonstrations, and relentless repetition, he taught the soldiers new tactics, formations, and battlefield maneuvers. He standardized training manuals and instilled a level of professionalism previously unseen in the Continental ranks. By spring, Washington's army emerged not as a desperate band of volunteers, but as a unified, disciplined fighting force. Valley Forge became a symbol not only of endurance, but of rebirth. By mid-1778, the Revolution had fundamentally changed. The British now recognized that suppressing the rebellion would not be easy. Their strategy shifted south, toward colonies they believed more loyal to the crown. They hoped Southern support, combined with their professional forces, would break American resistance once and for all. But the Americans had changed too. They were no longer the ragtag assembly that fled New York in 1776. They were seasoned, trained, and increasingly confident. The turning point at Saratoga, the French alliance, and the transformation at Valley Forge reshaped the trajectory of the war. For the first time, the idea of independence felt not just hopeful but achievable. The revolution was still far from won, but the tide had shifted. The world now understood what the British had tried to deny. America was fighting not a rebellion, but the birth of a nation. By the late 1770s, the American Revolution had entered its most violent, unpredictable, and transformative phase. This was the period when triumph and disaster coexisted, when hope constantly collided with fear, and when the fate of the rebellion hung on decisions made in battlefields, council tents, and royal courts. The British, frustrated by their failures in the North, shifted their entire war strategy toward the American South. They believed the southern colonies, with their economic importance, larger loyalist population, and weaker presence of continental forces, offered the best chance to crush the revolution once and for all. For the Americans, however, this shift opened new challenges, new battlegrounds, and new opportunities to rise. In 1778, Britain launched a full-scale campaign in the South, beginning with the capture of Savannah, Georgia. The fall of Savannah was swift, decisive, and demoralizing for the American cause. Thousands of troops, military supplies, and key port infrastructure fell under British control. To London, this victory confirmed what they had long believed: Loyalist support was strongest in the South and would help restore British dominance. Encouraged by the ease of their victory, British forces moved north towards South Carolina. In 1780, they achieved one of their greatest successes of the entire war, the capture of Charleston. After a 2-month siege, more than 5,000 American soldiers surrendered, the largest single American loss in the conflict. British General Henry Clinton celebrated Charleston's fall as a turning point that would soon unravel the rebellion. For a moment, it seemed Britain was on the verge of victory. American morale plummeted. Southern militias scattered, and loyalist groups formed local militias to support British rule. Washington's army, far to the north, could do little immediately to help. Supply shortages, weariness, and political tensions only deepened the crisis. But as history has shown time and again, the American Revolution thrived under pressure. The darkest moments often sparked the brightest acts of resilience. Even after the fall of Charleston, the South did not remain quiet. Instead, it erupted into a brutal, chaotic struggle, part guerrilla warfare, part civil war, part conventional fighting. Small bands of patriot fighters refused to surrender the countryside. These men were not regular soldiers. They were farmers, hunters, blacksmiths, and frontiersmen who knew the forests and swamps far better than British regulars. Among the most legendary of these irregular fighters was Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Marion and his men used hit-and-run attacks, surprise ambushes, and nighttime raids to harass British patrols, sabotage supply lines, and rescue prisoners. They disappeared into the marshes before the British could respond. To the British, Marion was an outlaw. To the locals, he was a hero. Elsewhere, militia leaders like Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens, and Elijah Clark launched their own campaigns of resistance. Their victories were often small, but each one eroded British control. Each one inspired more volunteers. Each one reminded the South that the fight was far from over. Still, guerrilla warfare alone could not defeat the British. The Continental Army needed a skilled commander who could unite Southern forces and launch a coordinated counteroffensive. They found that leader in General Nathanael Greene. Appointed by George Washington, Greene took command of the Southern Department in late 1780. He inherited a broken army, poorly supplied, often barefoot, and deeply outnumbered. But Greene brought something more important than numbers. He brought a strategy. Greene understood that he did not need to destroy the British army. He simply needed to exhaust it. His plan was not to win spectacular victories but to keep the British constantly on the move, stretching their supply lines, forcing them into hostile territory, and drawing them away from their coastal strongholds. This strategy unfolded across the Carolinas in a series of battles that tested both sides to their limits. One of the earliest turning points came at the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780. Here, frontier militias, known as the Over-Mountain Men, surrounded and defeated a large Loyalist force. The victory shocked the British High Command. It proved that Loyalist strength was not as solid as they believed and that Americans could deliver crushing blows even without formal armies. A few months later, in January 1781, another crucial battle unfolded at Cowpens. Under the command of General Daniel Morgan, American forces executed a brilliantly planned tactical deception. They pretended to retreat, luring the aggressive British commander Banastre Tarleton into a trap. The result was a decisive victory, destroying nearly all of Tarleton's elite troops and inflicting one of the most embarrassing defeats for the British. These victories invigorated the Patriot cause. Recruitment grew. Morale improved. Greene now had enough momentum to challenge British forces in a larger, more direct confrontation. In March 1781, Greene faced the main British army under General Charles Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Greene positioned his troops in 3 defensive lines, using the terrain to weaken the British advance. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and devastating. The British ultimately won the field, but at a staggering cost. Nearly a quarter of Cornwallis's army was killed or wounded. It was a victory that felt like a defeat. Cornwallis himself wrote, "I never saw such fighting since God made me." This victory forced Cornwallis to rethink his strategy. He abandoned the Carolina backcountry and shifted his focus north, toward Virginia, where he hoped to cut off American supply routes and crush resistance. Instead, he walked straight into the trap that would end the war. As Cornwallis moved toward the Chesapeake Bay, Greene regained control of the Carolinas and Georgia. One by one, British outposts fell. Loyalist support dwindled. The Southern strategy, once promising, had collapsed. Meanwhile, Washington and French General Rochambeau saw an opportunity. With French naval forces on the way and Cornwallis exposed on the Virginia coast, they coordinated a massive, complex movement of troops from New York to Virginia. Cornwallis settled in the small town of Yorktown, believing the British Navy would rescue him if necessary. But he underestimated the power of the new Franco-American alliance. When the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse arrived, they defeated the British Navy and sealed off the Chesapeake. Cornwallis was trapped. What happened next would become the final major drama of the Revolution. But that moment, Yorktown, deserves its own spotlight. And it is coming next. After 6 long years of war, the winds of the American Revolution shifted decisively in 1781 toward a final confrontation that would reshape not only a continent but the future of democracy around the world. The war had raged across forests, seacoasts, mountains, and farmlands, destroying cities, draining treasuries, and testing the endurance of an entire people. But now, all those struggles, all those sacrifices, all those moments of hope and heartbreak were converging on a single point: Yorktown. Yorktown, Virginia, was supposed to be a temporary base for British General Charles Cornwallis. He fortified the town with trenches, artillery placements, and defensive lines, confident that the mighty British Navy would be able to reinforce or evacuate him if needed. But his confidence was misplaced. France, now fully committed to America's victory, had dispatched a massive fleet under Admiral de Grasse. When the British Navy attempted to break through, the French met them in a fierce engagement known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. In a stunning outcome, the British failed to penetrate the blockade. Cornwallis was trapped. Meanwhile, George Washington and French General Rochambeau coordinated a monumental deception. They made the British believe they were preparing to attack New York City, while secretly marching more than 400 miles south with 17,000 Franco-American troops. The journey was grueling, but it was one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the entire war. By late September 1781, Washington and Rochambeau had surrounded Yorktown on land, while French naval forces closed off escape by sea. The siege began. American and French artillery unleashed relentless bombardment, tearing apart British fortifications. Night after night, the thunder of cannons echoed across the peninsula. Washington personally oversaw the construction of trenches, encouraging his men and pushing them forward with unwavering determination. 2 key British positions stood in the way, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10. Taking them would break the defensive line. On the night of October 14th, American and French forces launched a daring nighttime assault. The Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton, stormed Redoubt 10 in one of the most iconic moments of the war, climbing over earthworks, throwing grenades, and engaging in close combat. At the same time, French troops captured Redoubt 9. With these victories, the British defense crumbled. Cornwallis realized the situation was hopeless. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered. The British band played a tune that echoed across the battlefield: "The world turned upside down." And indeed, it had. Yorktown did not instantly end the war, but it shattered the British will to continue. In London, Parliament voted to cease offensive operations. Peace negotiations began soon after. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the conflict. Against all odds, the United States of America had won its independence. British forces agreed to withdraw, boundaries were defined, and American fishing rights off Canadian coasts were secured. But the treaty represented more than diplomatic terms. It marked the emergence of a new political experiment, a nation without a king. A republic founded not on aristocracy but on ideals, freedom, self-governance, and the belief that ordinary people could shape their own destiny. Around the world, governments watched with a mix of awe and alarm. For monarchies, the American victory was a frightening precedent. For oppressed peoples, it was a spark of hope. While the triumph was celebrated, the revolution left deep scars on the land and its people. More than 25,000 Americans had died, roughly 1% of the population at the time. Thousands more suffered lifelong injuries, amputations, or trauma. Countless civilians lost their homes, farms, and livelihoods. Cities like Savannah, Charleston, and New York had been occupied and scarred by war. Families had been torn apart by divided loyalties, particularly in southern colonies where patriot and loyalist neighbors sometimes fought each other more fiercely than foreign armies. Native American tribes faced devastating consequences. Many had sided with the British, hoping to protect their lands from colonial expansion. When the British withdrew, tribal alliances collapsed, and westward expansion accelerated with relentless force. Enslaved Africans had mixed outcomes. Some gained freedom by escaping to British lines. Many were abandoned or re-enslaved. Yet the revolution planted ideological seeds. Debates about liberty, rights, and equality created the earliest cracks in the institution of slavery, even though the road to justice would be painfully long. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary moments in the aftermath came not on a battlefield but in a hall in Annapolis. After the war, many expected George Washington to seize power. Some even urged him to become America's king. But Washington refused. In December 1783, he resigned his commission before Congress, choosing to return to private life. This act shocked the world. Leaders throughout history had fought wars to gain power. Washington willingly gave his up. King George III reportedly remarked, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington's decision helped establish a precedent for civilian control of the military and set the tone for a new style of leadership, one rooted in restraint, humility, and service. The American Revolution did not simply create a nation. It ignited ideological shockwaves across continents. In France, the ideas of liberty and republicanism contributed to the French Revolution. Across Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar studied America's struggle as inspiration for their own independence movements. In Europe, Enlightenment thinkers used America as proof that democratic governance was not only possible but practical. Even within the British Empire, reforms gradually emerged, reshaping political power. The revolution fundamentally challenged old hierarchies, showing that governments could be built from below rather than imposed from above. Yet even as the revolution transformed the world, it remained incomplete. Its promise of freedom did not extend equally to all. Women, despite crucial contributions to the war effort, would wait generations for political rights. Native Americans faced dispossession. Enslaved people continued to endure human bondage. Still, the revolution laid the philosophical foundation for future struggles for equality. Its words, "All men are created equal," became rallying cries for abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights activists, and countless others pushing America closer to its ideals. In the end, the American Revolution was far more than a colonial uprising. It was a turning point in the history of human governance. It proved that ordinary citizens could challenge an empire, that ideals could drive armies, and that the desire for liberty could outlast years of suffering and sacrifice. When the dust settled, America did not emerge perfect. But it emerged possible, a nation still being shaped, still being tested, still striving toward the promise first envisioned by those who fought through hardship, doubt, and danger. The revolution did not end in 1781 or 1783. Its spirit continues wherever people demand freedom, justice, and the right to determine their own future.